Lord of the Rings Online has some great scenery, some fantastic set pieces, and much more. But why did it fail? And perhaps even more importantly than that, did it even fail, or am I just baiting for YouTube clicks? Let me try and answer that, and let's jump in. Lord of the Rings Online was made by Turbine Inc., which are now known as Warner Brothers Game Boston, and it was released in 2007. And this is just a few years after World of Warcraft. And while nobody really admits it, at one point this game was touted as a potential WoW killer. Spoiler alert, it did not kill World of Warcraft. So before you start the game, you can look at a few different cinematics. There's one for each race, and I think there's one for each class. And I mentioned World of Warcraft, it definitely gives me that kind of starting vibe. I decide to start my journey as a stout dwarven hunter, and the character creator, if I'm honest, feels a little bit limited, but it is definitely passable. And as I get into the game, I'm immediately met by Gandalf. I was a little bit taken aback by this because this is obviously a main character. Now, Gandalf basically helps you with the bare minimum, sort of teaches you the mechanics of how to move. And I'm not really 100% sure why he's talking to me, but nevertheless he is. It seems to be currently, at the time of this, set before the actual Hobbit book, because he talks to Thorin about a potential burglar named Baggins. Once Gandalf has left, there's a mine that is shaking and you need to get inside and tell the miners to leave. Most of the miners listen to you, except there's one dwarf miner who doesn't actually hear this, digs his way through a tunnel and outblasts a troll. And the troll chases after Gimli. And you find a preserved dead dwarf in some elven ruins. Now, I'm not going to embarrass myself by pronouncing some of these names. If you are a Lord of the Rings enthusiast, then you will know what it is, and I'm not going to, shame myself. You make note of this, but you keep chasing after the troll, and as you catch up to the troll, you get saved. You get white knighted by Gandalf, which is sort of funny because he's neither a knight nor is he white. At least I think he's grey at this point. And this is sort of what I enjoy about Lord of the Rings. The set pieces are very well done. You basically go into these instanced areas that only you or sometimes a party are in, and you get told a story where you're part of the story. I think in my playthrough with the dwarf, I experienced 3 of them, and I enjoy all 3 of them. There's a little cinematic that sort of explains what's happened in the time that's passed, and actually I think 2 years passed from when you find the preserved dwarven body and then you get put out in the actual real world. And quickly, I have to say, one thing that I really don't like is the UI. I find the user interface to be pretty ugly. I find the ability icons to not be very clear. It's all a little bit ugly in my opinion. Now obviously, beauty is subjective, but I wasn't really a fan. One thing I didn't like about the UI as well is that when you were fighting, if you're moused over the enemy, you have a box over it that gives you information about what you're actually mousing over, and it just gets in the way. It just doesn't need to be there, and it's pretty ugly. The whole UI, as I said, is not nice. I don't like it very much at all. When you're out in the open world, I go and speak to an elf. For some reason there's some elves and dwarves all together, and you learn about Elrond's riddle. Now, if I'm honest, I sort of found the story a little bit confusing at this point. I think if you're a Lord of the Rings aficionado, this will all be making sense and you'll probably actually be really enjoying it. But for somebody who's a way more casual fan than that, I found it a little bit confusing. I think the person who's telling me about Elrond's riddle is actually Elrond's son, and it turns out we're now looking for Skorgrim, which is the dwarf that we found in the elven ruins in the dwarven mine. I would say that I found the dwarven story a little bit more complicated than the human one. Now, the human one I actually do after the dwarven experience, but I didn't realize that at the time. You go to where Skorgrim, I believe, was originally slain, and you see that there is a red flower on the other side of this bridge. The elf tells you to go into the original mine and see what's around where the body was. And this is another critique I would say I had at this moment. I sort of realized that the game was going to be a bit of a running simulator. I felt like there was an awful lot of running with not really much reason. The pacing I felt was a little bit slow. You make your way through the mine now, and there are actually some enemies here. And I've got to say, I also really found the combat to be a little bit clunky. Sometimes I would try and do an ability, and simply it wouldn't go off the first time I pressed it. Now that might be a little bit of lag because maybe I wasn't standing still. Whatever the reason, combat just felt really awkward. Now if I was to compare it to something like World of Warcraft, I would compare it unfavorably. I think Lord of the Rings sort of did a bad job of imitating World of Warcraft, and it really just doesn't feel as good. Again, that's subjective, but for me, I think that'll be one of the main reasons that this game probably didn't do better than it did. Anyway, you go to where the body was. The body is now gone, but there are flowers there. Turns out nobody's checked on this in 2 years, and now the riddle starts to make sense a little bit. You then get told to follow the flowers because they're on the path as well. The flowers lead you to Skorgrim's tomb, and then there's a dwarf called Gorma, who is basically, I think, the steward of the Dower Hands. Now, he wants you to pay respects, and you do this by going and getting some stones and killing some bats. Not quite sure how that pays respects, and it seems like Gorma's actually planning on resurrecting Skorgrim. So you go and tell Dwalin about this plan, and then the main story sort of loses its thread a little bit here, because some dwarfs are sick, and you have to help them. You also get given a little bit of a strange quest, where the quest is to get some in-game currency, which you don't actually do anything, you just sort of like click through the menus. You then get the currency and then you get your mount. I think this is basically just to introduce you to the idea of the store, and the store is very prominent in this game for sure. The mount, by the way, at these low levels seems to not be that much faster. I think it might only be like 10% faster than running, which sort of felt a little bit underwhelming considering the amount of running I felt like I was doing. Now, I didn't really explain about the quest, but there's a golden glowing ring quest, which is basically the main story. Then there is a gold ring, which is basically a secondary side story. And then there's a blue ring, which sort of just tells you more information about the quest. For this playthrough here, I was mostly focusing on just the main story. But there is a quest at this point where it tells you to go to sleep on this bedroll, and when you go to sleep, you have a vision. Galadriel herself comes and gives you a vision of what may come in the story of Middle-earth. You see the Fellowship, you see a classic Gandal scene, and she sees you often in the vision. Some classic foreshadowing here. And again, I'm reminded how much I actually enjoy the stories that are being told and the way they're being told. I think the quest text is perhaps a little bit verbose, it's a little bit long and a little bit unclear at times, but you can definitely feel there is a story here, and I think for Lord of the Rings enthusiasts, that makes a lot of sense. I would say, for example, that the story in Lord of the Rings is much better than MMOs that had come before it. It feels like the story is the center place of this game. Back on with the main story, the river is polluted and the birds are sick. You have to kill some birds to find that out. And I also want to bring attention to the looting system. You don't really directly loot the enemy that's in front of you. What happens is, in the bottom right, there's basically a icon that you click and it holds all of your loot that you've had in maybe like the last hour or something like that. Now, my first time through this, I didn't actually notice it for a little bit, which meant I probably missed out on some loot. I don't hate this system, but I definitely don't like it. It's passable, but it sort of feels a little bit underwhelming to me. I'd like to see what the enemy in front of me drops. Maybe that's an option you can turn on. Maybe not. We then need to go and find the source of the pollution, and I go to a cave and outside there is an elf. They tell me that the land will try and heal itself, and inside there must be some medicinal plants. That feels very convenient. Anyway, in the tunnels I go, do some combat, find the shrine, kill the undead, and all's good. Now, I would say that there appears to be a decent variety of enemies even in the starting zone, and I was quite happy with that. When I did the human starting zone, I didn't really sort of think that. It was mostly just humans and then the odd wolf or boar. What's interesting, when you are in the cave though, it is actually quite easy to get lost. Doesn't really tell you where the doors are, doesn't really tell you where you've been. Like a true RPG, as you go into an unexplored area, the cave lights up and it becomes part of your map. But it is quite easy to get lost. I liked it though. You take the remedy to Dwalin, and then he sends you back to Gorma, who's waiting to rise Skorgrim from the dead. And then you set out on an epic quest. Your goal is to stop the raising of Skorgrim, but it turns out that either the mage is too strong and you don't want to face him head on. So you have to sneak around the side, and just as you sneak around the side, you start seeing the whole piece. You see the raising of Skorgrim, and again, this is another part where I think the story is just told so well. There are some big set pieces, and most of the time they feel very rewarding. Skorgrim and Ivor basically betray Gorma, and then you have to flee the cave because it's all collapsing. It's just very well done, honestly, and I cannot reiterate that enough. The story is just probably the best part of this game, and I can imagine if you are a Lord of the Rings enthusiast, then it would be even better. Now, let me be clear before we continue that I'm doing a series here called Why Did It Fail? You can sort of think of it being like Josh Strife Hayes' worst MMO ever. not every MMO that he covers in that category he's actually calling the worst MMO ever. It's just a series. So in this series, I'm going to be looking at why did certain MMOs not live up to the, max expectation that could have happened for that game. But let's be clear, Lord of the Rings has been having content made for it for like over a decade now. It did not fail in that sense, but it did not live up to anywhere near, say, something like World of Warcraft. And really, if we have a look at Google Trends, which isn't the best indication, but it's one of the only ones that we have, you can see that Lord of the Rings didn't really make any impact or any inroads or was anywhere near as popular as, say, something like World of Warcraft. But that's not to say it failed. There is a dedicated player base who's been playing this game now for over a decade, and it's nearly 2. But in this series, I'm going to look at MMOs that probably aren't still going and aren't still one of the top 5 or so MMOs. Now back to the story, it sort of changes pace a little bit here. I speak to a quest giver and I have to go and find somebody in the Arming Cave, and when I get there, they've been hit over the head. It turns out the Durahans have been on the rob. Now, I must go and prove this to Dwarven because they don't believe me. It's at this point I get sent to Noglond and Thrushlands. Now, if this wasn't Lord of the Rings, I think I was being trolled by some of these names. They're a little bit comical and a little bit unusual. I then have to speak to a dwarf who, before I speak to him, randomly is being attacked by lynxes, and it turns out the Durahans have been maybe working with some goblins. Apparently the old city is infested with them. I get sent to the old city and I find an enemy who I kill, and they've got the gold and I get it back. I then get sent to Gondamon. Again, sorry if my pronunciations are awful, I do apologise. And there, the main story would have me find out about a missing elf prince. And we want to mount a rescue, but the dwarfs say that if they go and try and mount the rescue on their own, then the elves will think that it was them rather than the Durahans, and they don't want that because there's different factions of dwarfs, and it's the evil ones that have actually captured them rather than the good ones that they are. So they say we need somebody who's neither elf nor dwarf. And at this point we go and get the Ranger Langlass, because he's going to be the one that helps you. And then we do an entire epic set piece. Me and Langlass, we go through killing all of these enemies, trying to get ourselves to the missing prince, and we slay various camps, and it's actually quite hard because it's the main story, and I think I'm quite low level for this, and it's level 12 and I'm level 8, and we're slaying our way there, and I'm shooting, doing all the combat which isn't actually that engaging, and we get to the end and then the prince actually isn't there. And I was like, okay, that's a little bit sad, but fair enough. But I was reminded that the combat just never felt good, and at this point I made the decision that I'm probably just going to try a different character, different class, and see if it feels better. However, what I do beforehand, because I'm low level, I go and do some of the side quests, and I wanted to do this because I wanted to see what they were, where did they send me. And if I'm honest, they sort of sent me to all of the same locations that I'd already been in. And I was a little bit underwhelmed by that because they send you back to places that you've already been, rather than have something like where there's multiple quests all, entangled and entwined and sending you to the same place for maximum XP. No, it would have sent you one place and then later on it would send you back. And that I felt was a little bit underwhelming, and I confirmed that when I did the human zone, that same thing was pretty much happening. It was sending you back to places you'd already been because it didn't have anywhere else to send you, basically. And as I was doing these quests though, I did notice that I said it was a bit of a running simulator, but there's all kinds of paid stuff you can do in this game. One of the most annoying, obnoxious ones is the fact that you can simply pay to teleport to a quest giver using these mithril coins. Now, it's not like very expensive, I didn't do it, but I really hated that as an option. I can't imagine that option being there when the game first came out. I sort of suspect that happened when it was a sub fee and it went free to play, but I really didn't like it. It felt like the store was very heavily pushed, and it was a little bit jarring for me personally. However, it definitely seemed like the cash shop was maybe a little bit over pushed. But then again, I didn't spend anything on this game. I literally downloaded it for free, I played it for free, no sub fee, didn't spend anything, and I was having a decent time. The game has everything you would want in terms of the talent trees, there's hobbies where you can play music, there's loads of professions and all that kind of stuff. I didn't really delve deep into those systems, but they are definitely there, definitely present, and I think you could probably get lost just becoming like a miner, a prospector, or whatever it's called in Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of professions, there's hobbies, there's a lot of extraneous activities to do, which all seem like that they would be enjoyable and maybe help progress your character in various ways. There were a couple of extra things that I found really fascinating. For example, there's a quest giver who basically allows you to change the difficulty for like titles and stuff like that. I think that is a really cool system and I was very happy to see it. There's deeds and there's titles and there's all kinds of really interesting systems that I never really touched upon. There's quite a few little things that annoy me. One of them is that you have to be looking directly at an object to interact with it. Whilst logically this makes sense, when you're trying to do things quickly, it just feels really awkward. And then there's the time it takes to actually interact. Instead of it being instant, you have to wait for this bar to fill up, and again it just sort of feels slow. The scenery and the graphics in this game are sometimes beautiful. I rolled off to the Shire and the game looks truly fantastic. It might be a little bit dated now, but honestly I still really like it. One unfortunate thing for me is that the game is mostly a PvE game. There is a monster v monster PvP, but when I tried it, there was nobody there, and it's actually just going to be a monster, not your actual character, versus other monsters, and that's not the kind of PvP I want. I want my character to be there, and I want to be engaged and level up and all that kind of good stuff. I enjoyed seeing Gandalf and having little hints of the story and stuff like that. In the human playthrough, you see Strider, and I suspect it, it depends on the other races, but I suspect you would see other main characters depending on who you played. But if I was to try and answer the question as to why this game failed or, didn't hit the heights that it perhaps could have, it literally comes back to some of the basics. The high points of Lord of the Rings are pretty simple. The scenery and the environments are truly sometimes outstanding. A beautiful world with pretty decent graphics that have held up even to this day. And the story set pieces are very well told. Sure, at times the story can be a little bit verbose in the text form, but the set pieces are outstanding. And the low points are also pretty obvious. The combat, for me, it just felt a little bit lackluster. It is not as smooth or as free-flowing as it could have been, and really the combat is the main thing you do in a game. And that means if you don't like the combat, you probably don't like the game. The next major low point is the UI. The UI is dated, which makes sense because this game is over 15 years old. But a little bit like the combat, the UI is something that you are always looking at, and therefore if you don't like it, then you might not get on with the game. Now, I didn't try plugins. It might be possible that you can change some of this, but by default, I wasn't really a huge fan. So did a game that's had content made for it over the years actually fail? Maybe, maybe not. I think the main thing that held this game back is simply its combat. Sure, there's probably other issues with the game, but the combat I think is just the main thing you do, and it doesn't feel right and it doesn't feel good. However, if you are a Lord of the Rings enthusiast, then the story is right there for you, the world is right there for you. It looks very good in that sense, and it sort of makes me a little bit excited for Amazon Game Studios' Lord of the Rings if they can do it justice. And you know what? I'm tempted to watch the films and maybe read the books. I read The Hobbit and then not the actual Lord of the Rings books. Don't judge me, it is what it is. For now, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Why do you think it failed? Did it fail? Let me know. Big shout out to my Patreons, much love to you guys. Have a beautiful day, like and subscribe. Goodbye.